Hello, I'm Glenn McGuinness, and welcome to Outburst. This week, we're asking Canadians their thoughts on the progress of truth and reconciliation in Canada.
It's been more than 2 years since a final gathering marked the first steps to truth and reconciliation in Canada.
Canada, this is your rite of passage. If you really are a citizen of this country, take that next step. Get out of that protected environment that we were supposedly put in and take a risk and take that call to action.
94 calls of action were put forth by an independent committee to the federal government, each one aimed at addressing the legacy of residential schools through stories, songs, research, and legislation. This exhibit at the Wabano Centre in Ottawa is a permanent place for some of these stories to be honored. Of the 94 calls to action put forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, only a fraction have been completed. Some are still in progress, and others haven't been completed at all. Our question to Canadians: how would you rate the government's progress on truth and reconciliation?
When Trudeau was elected, there was definitely more kind of optimism as to what would be going on. But now with this whole Kinder Morgan thing, I think that it's kind of gone down a bit of a slippery slope. So not super great, to answer your question.
This is not an event that's going to happen where we can say one day, okay, we've done truth, we've done reconciliation, we got it, let's move on. It's not going to happen that way. It took decades or more to get to where we are, and I think it's going to take us a long time.
I think they're trying to get the truth out, but you know, that's a tough one too. I'm Métis myself, and I think there's got to come a point where you stop paying the price for the past. You know, there's got to be a drawing line. You know, it's like they didn't invent this world. Yes, you know, a lot of the land was theirs first, but you know, there's reasons why people lose things too. It's choices.
I don't know that we have to keep apologizing forever. Land claims has been settled in a lot of areas. I think there needs to be tighter control on how these monies are spent. Some bands do very well with it, others don't.
I feel that a lot of work has been done in recent years to try and reconcile what has been bitter differences. I'm proud of the way an attempt has been made to make things right.
I think it's come a ways from my perspective, and I think at least it's getting talked about a lot now. And of course, the statement is that talk is talk, and we need action. And I think there's obviously going to continue to be room for more action and more talk until the situation is better. Yeah, and that's going to take a long time. I think it's going to be a long process. Yeah,
I think they're doing well in their progress and everything else. It's just a slow, long, roundabout thing, and everybody wants to speak, and they didn't realize how many were actually going to want to step up to the plate and give their stories. And so I think they're eventually going to get it looked after and the book completed. So
on a scale of 1 to 10, let's say, I'd probably say about a 5. They've made some superficial progress on that, but I think a lot of some of the more deeper and harder work that has to be done, I think we're still years, if not decades, away from. There are deep, as I know before, there are deep systemic issues, I think, in regards to how First Nations people are treated in this country. And so I think that, so it's not entirely the government's fault, but I think they could be doing more. I think there needs to be more consultation, particularly with, the issue of pipelines and whatnot. But yeah, we'll have to see what happens, I guess.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action in its final report in 2015. These include reducing the number of Aboriginal children in government care, eliminating educational gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians, protecting language rights, creating curriculum about residential schools and Aboriginal people's historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, and a public inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women. These calls to action are meant to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation.
The residential school system has become a black mark on Canada's history. It was a network of boarding institutions funded by the former Department of Indian Affairs and run by the Catholic Church to assimilate Indigenous youth into society. It has been to blame for the physical and sexual abuse of many children, as well as depriving them of their language and culture. Back in 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood up in the House of Commons to apologize on behalf of the Government of Canada for its part in the program.
The burden of this experience is properly ours as a government and as a country. There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. You have been working on recovering from this experience for a long time. And in a very real sense, we are now joining you on this journey. The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
Without unanimous support, the House of Commons recently passed an historic motion to ask Pope Francis to apologize. But as for the Catholic Church, there has been no apology to date, with Pope Francis claiming he could not personally respond. So we took this emotional topic to Canadians. How important is a papal apology to reconciliation in Canada?
Very important. As someone who considers himself a Christian, I believe it is the responsibility and duty of all Christians to own up to the fact of the mistakes that have been made in the name of Jesus Christ and the Christian faith. So I think it is very important that the Pope come and apologize. I was actually quite shocked that the Pope announced that they weren't going to come and apologize. I'm still baffled by that decision, given particular Pope Francis' reputation as being very liberal and very open-minded and all this sort of stuff.
End it, you know that this has happened, you know that you've done it, and you're the leader of the church, so let's apologize and get it corrected.
I think recognition is important. An apology, to be honest, I don't know if it would feel sincere ever. Because they did what they thought was right at the time, and so we're moving forward now, and we have to change and acknowledge and shift. But I don't know that an apology is what I would need, but I would need recognition of where we've done things wrong, and how can we change going forward.
I think it's pretty important because I believe the church is responsible for a lot of the hurt that has happened in Canada, and I think that it's important that people take responsibility for the actions.
I think that's hugely important. I'm Jewish, and I know that the papal apology for the Holocaust meant a huge amount to my community personally. So I feel like with the residential schools, obviously the church was hugely involved, and missionary activity in general made such a huge impact on First Nations and Inuit and Métis communities. I think that apology would be really, really important.
I think it's really important. I mean, he's the head of the church. I'm not a Catholic, but when you're a leader, you have to be accountable for what your organization has done, and even historically, even if though you weren't involved. And they cause a lot of harm, and I think that he should. I don't think he has to worry about admitting anything. People know what happened, so I don't think legally he should concern himself with that. I think he should apologize.
It's not for me to tell the Pope what to do. I'm not, but I think that would be a real positive step forward.
I absolutely do, yes. I think it's very important that that reconciliation continue, and that's just part of the process. I think that this church, as well as civilization in general, ought to be more cognizant of what's happened and start to make reparations.
I think it's important just because,
I mean, it's our ancestors that were responsible for the whole ordeal, right? And I think it's important to get closure, because if they apologize, that gives us one step forward to trying to make up for what we did. But obviously there's like some other things that they could do as well. I don't really have any ideas, but I feel like there's just more that they could be doing, but definitely like an apology would be a step in the right direction.
Child poverty amongst Indigenous youth is considered by some to be a crisis in this country. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal accused the federal government of discrimination against Indigenous children for providing less funding for childcare than would be available in non-Indigenous communities. We sent our cameras out to ask Canadians how we can improve the quality of life for First Nations children in Canada. Our question: what is the most important thing the government can do for Indigenous children in this country?
The lower parts of Canada, the southern parts of Canada, I'd say education's hugely important. However, if you were to go up north to Inuit communities, I think there's a different kind of education that's needed, because they perhaps don't need the kind of education that we would prescribe as academia.
I think there needs to be better education. I know that from my experience, I learned about pioneers in grade 2 and the European perspective in grade 2, and I didn't learn anything about First Nations history until I was probably in grade 10 or 11. So I really grew up without any perspective of First Nations history, and even without really knowing about residential schools. That was something I didn't learn about till high school either. And I think that being able to implement in younger grades some of the First Nations history and culture, and trying to get rid of this kind of silence and ignorance of peoples within our country in our schools would be really important.
Well, I think the first thing is making sure that they have homes that are appropriate, where they have decent housing, they have water, they have all the basic things that the rest of us all take for granted, and that if parents have difficulty, that they have support through social services, education, training, and support to families to keep them together and to provide the things that children need.
Well, I remember Minister Scott, the late Andy Scott, was going to have the big Kelowna Accord, and really, and I know he was passionate about it. He was a personal friend of mine, and there were some real change items that were going to be discussed there, and it was turned down by the new government. And I don't think they've ever come to the level, and Paul Martin was the Prime Minister at the time, I don't think the current governments, although they speak well, have never raised to that level where they were going to do something that was really going to be a real change agent. The current government just be more action-oriented with your words. There's just so much to do. There's been generations of discrimination, and with the residential school system, 3 or 4 generations of broken people. And the systems and the governments and policies have to acknowledge the fact that existed. They do, but really start to embrace the change that's necessary. Easy to say, very hard to do.
Provincial governments frequently have a role to play there as well, because that responsibility has been handed back to them by the feds. So I would say that education is probably the first thing that both the federal and provincial governments should look at in improving advantages for young people who are First Nations.
Support. Definitely support. I find that we abandon a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada, especially considering the generations before them, what they've gone through and what this country has done to them, is support. Financial support, educational support, just everything. I think that we need to pay attention to these communities.
I think it's still the basic: support the families and make sure there's enough food and the ability to have a regular day. The more involved schooling helps, but it's not enough on its own. The schools on the reserves help, but it's still not enough.
I think the most important thing that the federal government can do for Indigenous children is to give them the same opportunities that the rest of our kids have. And so that means education, that means access to water, clean water, that means health care, and I know it's not easy, but they're Canadians.
According to the federal government, Indigenous children aged 0 to 14 make up 52.2% of children in foster care in private homes. Also, 7% of children in this country live in poverty, and for Indigenous children, that number is much higher at 38%. We sent our cameras out to ask Canadians why these numbers are so high. Our question: why do you think First Nations children are overrepresented in the welfare system?
Well, I think it's a systematic thing, right? The abuses that happened to entire people have consequences to their descendants. It's just natural. I think that that's what happens, yeah.
I think it's a long history of neither side understanding each other and taking the fact to even acknowledge that we are really different, and we just have to accept that fact. It's really simple. It shouldn't be, it's not rocket science, realistically. It really isn't, so simple.
The Canadian public seems to get a very bad opinion of the way the people are in the welfare system and not being looked after properly, you know, and the children need to be cared for more, just the same as the white children and the Asian children. Everybody needs to be treated exactly the same.
Well, I think it's a systemic thing. I think it has to go back to some help with parenting and so on, and it seems like the children really need a lot of help, and so they should be starting with the parents, I think, and giving them the assistance.
A lot of systemic issues. First of all, I mean, historically, I mean, First Nations people have been treated quite poorly. We, put them on the worst land that we could possibly give them, put them when talking on reserve, and then off reserve as well too. They're treated very poorly as well too. The extensive incarceration of First Nations people is a huge issue. I think they're grossly overrepresented, and I think that is a problem of systemic racism.
Inherent discrimination. And I can't explain that any better than that. I mean, it's systematic where people are trying to make the right steps forward, but it's not there yet. The court systems, the social systems, there's still a stigma attached, and people are trying hard to break down those barriers. We're not there yet. So I think it's the system has to be forced from the top down to adapt quicker and faster. It's not fair.
I think that the Indian Act in Canada has really limited opportunities for First Nations people for various reasons, mostly because the length of any government of any band is limited to 2 years, and it's too short a mandate for a community to really get things done that need to happen, especially for the young people.
I think it's because things like poverty and abuse become cyclical, and it's hard to break out of that cycle. So when there was so much taken away from them initially, it's harder than a lot of people can make it sound to just bounce back from that. So I think it's still just a cyclical loop that we're stuck in, and hopefully we can take steps to change it and get out of that.
In general, First Nations, Métis, Inuit groups are systematically oppressed by the government. There have been plenty of over-apprehensions on reservations and from First Nations families in general. There's an institutional racism that wants to take First Nations kids out of First Nations homes.
Well, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that, but I think there's a lot of history that if you do damage to families, then that damage is going to continue down through generations. I mean, I was very fortunate in terms of the parents that I have. We didn't have a lot of money, but they had been brought up in families that were stable. And when you have instability in families that goes on from one generation, it's hard to know how to be a good parent if you haven't been well parented. So I think that has an effect as you go on.
Probably because of a lack of hope, I think, garnered from previous generations and what was done to the generation before them, and not really understanding how to move forward or how to get out of where they're at. I think when you look at a community, you always have generations before you to help you, guide you, bring you where you need to go. And then if there's a lack or a sense of hopelessness, that can also transcend generations. And I think we're getting into a point where those generations are starting to realize that they can get themselves out, or kind of work as a community to overcome some of those hopelessness or situations that have happened in the past. So I think it's kind of a legacy of their past, but also I think understanding that they need to get over it or move forward with where do you want to be and how do you see them as a people to move forward, I guess.
The British monarchy plays an important role in Canada's history. Canada is, of course, a constitutional monarchy, and the Queen is our head of state. After all, it was Queen Victoria who designated Ottawa as Canada's capital. Canada is also a member of the British Commonwealth. So, with a brand new royal baby and, of course, a royal wedding, do they play an essential role in our culture, or do they have no real significance at all? Our question: how important is the royal family to you?
Not at all. Not at all. My wife's family really loves the royal family. They have a big, more as celebrities than as actual like monarchs of Canada, because they, would disagree with a lot of their politics. But to me, I don't know who they are. I don't care about them.
Not important.
Can you elaborate on that?
I just don't really know anything about them. I don't think they know anything about me. I don't get the impression they care about me too much, so they're just not a concern for me.
They're nice to read on the news. I'm not really attached to them, but I mean, obviously being a Commonwealth country, there's an attachment. It's not something that I stay awake at night though. No, not for their health, no.
Oh, I think culturally and historically, all of my relatives are from that little island, so Irish and Scottish and English and Welsh, so it's always something fun to watch. I mean, I don't know that I'll get up and watch the wedding, but I might, and it's fun to see the children. My mom loved the royal family, so, but I mean, it doesn't play a big impact in our life, but having a constitutional monarchy, is part of our culture. I think that's quite interesting, and it's fun to be part of the Commonwealth.
Oh, the royal family. To me personally, not that important, but I have a great respect for history. I've read every history of every English king and queen and all that stuff. I find it fascinating. I love tradition. As far as the legality part, having an independent queen or king, sovereign, float above the system and remain neutral, but have constitutionally anyway some absolute control is a nice concept, and I think it makes us unique. As far as the great respect for the legislative abilities, I think it's Canada speaks for itself. When Trudeau repatriated the Constitution, I think that firmly put us in our own stead, and we look after. But tradition-wise, it's a great tradition.
I particularly like our form of government, which has the royal family as titular head of state, if you like. Even though they don't have a direct role here in Canada anymore, I think that our history with the Crown is a really interesting one, and probably a good example for the rest of the world in terms of how well you can actually do this whole monarchy thing.
Not important at all.
Why?
I find it interesting in the way that I find Hollywood celebrities an interesting clickbait kind of diversion, but and I understand the symbolism, and it's desirable for lots of people to, for some reason, have that symbolism, but for me personally, it really doesn't make any difference.
Honestly, not really. Apart that we're still part of the Commonwealth, they don't really come here and do much for us. Last time I saw the Queen in Canada on TV, it's been a long time ago. I don't know, they're not important to me at all. I don't even know why we still have her face on our money. Sorry.
Not important. No, not at all. I have more important things to worry about. I'm a student. I have 2 jobs. It's not something that I need to be focusing my time on, and I don't think other people should be focusing their time on that. But if you like it, for sure, that's for you, but it's not for me.
Oh, I don't believe in the monarchy at all. I think they should demolish. At all. No kings, no queens, no princes. What for? They should spend their money for the people that they don't have food to eat. I don't believe at all in the kings and queens. Like in my country, we had kings and queens. I'm not religious person like Shah of Iran. I'm not religious, but I'm not monarchist at all. I think they should demolish it from the face of the earth.
What is the significance of 1936 in the history of the British monarchy? Queen Elizabeth is born. Queen Victoria's death. 3 kings on the throne.
Queen Victoria's death.
Queen Elizabeth is born.
I would say Queen Elizabeth is born.
B, the Queen Victoria's death.
3 kings on the throne.
It is 3 kings on the throne, sir.
Yes, 3 kings on the throne. That's what I said.
Very good.
Thank you.
1936 was called the Year of 3 Kings. It's the only time in recent history that there have been 3 kings on the British throne in the same year. In 1936, the United Kingdom was ruled by King George V, who was in ill health. George V died on January 20th of that year and was succeeded by his oldest son, Edward. King Edward VIII assumed the title of King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions after his father's death, but created a constitutional crisis because he wanted to marry an American divorcee. Both the Anglican Church and the government wouldn't support his decision, so Edward abdicated the position on December 11th, 1936. His younger brother Albert then assumed the throne and became King George VI. The Year of 3 Kings has happened only twice before in British history, in 1066 and in 1483. That's all for this episode of Outburst. Like what you see? Well, you can watch more full episodes on our website at www.cpac.ca, as well as on our YouTube channel. You can find lots more great material there, and you can weigh in on the issues that matter to you the most. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram simply by searching for CPAC, or on Twitter at CPAC_TV. I'm Glenn McGuinness, and on behalf of all my colleagues at the Cable Public Affairs Channel, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Outburst.